A little girl texts Millionaire, "Don't eat the soup." He watches her pour it down the sink. Before we begin, like this video if you still believe in being good to others. Enjoy the story. In the gleaming marble kitchen of a Manhattan penthouse, 7-year-old Ava Silvers stood on her favorite stepping stool, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she stirred a pot of homemade chocolate chip cookies. The late afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across granite countertops that sparkled like jewels. This was her sanctuary, her sacred space where she and Daddy created magic together every Sunday afternoon since Mommy went to heaven 3 years ago. But today felt different. Today the kitchen held shadows that hadn't been there before, and the usual warmth felt corrupted by something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. Ava's keen nose wrinkled as an unfamiliar scent drifted from the stovetop, cutting through the sweet aroma of vanilla and butter. Not the warm, comforting fragrance of Daddy's favorite tomato basil soup that usually filled their home with love and memories of better times. This smelled clinical, sharp, antiseptic, like the medicine cabinet at Dr. Peterson's office when she'd had her tonsils checked last month, or the strange liquid that made her feel floaty and disconnected during her dental surgery. Her father, Drake Silvers, sat hunched over his mahogany desk in his home office 3 rooms away, completely absorbed in quarterly reports and financial projections that could make or break his company's upcoming IPO. At 42, Drake had built an empire in functional foods from nothing, transforming a small startup into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But the pressure of taking the company public was slowly destroying him from the inside out. Dark circles shadowed his once bright blue eyes, and his broad shoulders carried the crushing weight of 1,000 investor expectations, hundreds of employee livelihoods, and the constant fear that one wrong decision could destroy everything he'd worked 20 years to build. He trusted Natalie completely to take care of the domestic details he no longer had time for. She cooked elaborate meals with ingredients he couldn't pronounce. She cleaned their penthouse until it gleamed like a museum. She managed his schedule with military precision, screening his calls, organizing his meetings, even picking out his clothes. She promised to make everything easier, to take the burden off his shoulders, to help him navigate this stressful period with grace and success. She promised a lot of things, all delivered with that dazzling smile and those perfectly manicured hands that seemed to know exactly how to touch him when he needed comfort most. Ava tiptoed toward the stove where a large copper pot of soup simmered ominously. Natalie had been very specific about this particular soup, more secretive than usual. "It's a very special recipe, sweetheart," she'd said with that practiced smile that never quite reached her emerald eyes. "Your father needs his rest more than ever right now. This will help him feel so much better, so much more relaxed." The way she'd said that last word made something cold slither down Ava's spine. But Ava had inherited far more than her father's razor-sharp business instincts and her mother's gentle heart. She possessed a gift that even Drake didn't fully understand or appreciate yet. A palate so sensitive and refined that it bordered on supernatural. Her sense of taste could detect flavors that others missed entirely, nuances that escaped even professional chefs. Uncle Antonio called it la lingua de la verità, the tongue of truth. When she was 5, she'd identified 17 different herbs in his grandmother's secret pasta sauce just by smell alone, describing each one's origin and growing season with the precision of a sommelier. Now, as she carefully dipped the worn, wooden spoon into the crimson soup and touched it hesitantly to her tongue, that extraordinary gift screamed danger with every nerve ending. The taste hit her immediately, a complex symphony of flavors that told a terrifying story. Underneath the familiar sweetness of San Marzano tomatoes and the earthy comfort of fresh basil, something bitter and medicinal lurked like a predator in tall grass. Something that made her tongue tingle and go slightly numb, spreading that distinctive, metallic aftertaste that reminded her of the liquid medicine that made her sleepy and compliant before her dental surgery. The same taste that had made her feel like she was floating outside her own body, watching everything happen to someone else. Her heart began to race with the primal terror of a child who instinctively recognizes mortal danger. This wasn't right. This wasn't safe. This wasn't food at all. It was a weapon disguised as nourishment. With trembling fingers that felt suddenly clumsy and thick, she pulled out her phone. The pink iPhone Daddy had given her for emergencies only. The one with his contact programmed as the first speed dial. Her small hands flew across the screen with desperate urgency, typing the most important message of her young life, each letter feeling like it might be the difference between her father's survival and destruction. "Daddy, don't eat the soup. Please, something's wrong with it. It tastes like medicine and it's making my tongue numb. Don't eat it." 3 floors below, in the leather-appointed silence of his home office, Drake's phone buzzed insistently against his mahogany desk, the screen lighting up with his daughter's panicked message just as he lifted his spoon toward his waiting mouth. Drake's phone screen glowed with Ava's desperate message just as he lifted his silver spoon toward his mouth, the warm soup releasing its aromatic steam that should have been comforting, but now felt ominous. The tomato basil soup smelled absolutely divine, just like everything Natalie prepared with such meticulous care and attention to detail. She had such an extraordinary gift for knowing exactly what he needed after those brutal 18-hour days that left him hollow-eyed and shaking with exhaustion. The warmth, the comfort, the way her meals seemed to melt away his stress and leave him feeling strangely peaceful and compliant. But Ava's panicked text stopped him cold, the words burning into his retinas with an urgency that made his stomach clench with sudden dread. "Don't eat the soup." He set down his spoon with hands that had begun to tremble, staring at the screen as his daughter's message repeated in his mind like a warning bell. His little Ava didn't send dramatic messages or cry wolf for attention. She was thoughtful beyond her years, careful with her words, precise in her observations, just like her mother Sarah had been before the cancer stole her away. When Ava said something was wrong, when that special gift of hers detected danger that others missed, something was inevitably, terrifyingly wrong. Drake pushed back from his leather chair and walked quietly toward the kitchen, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors as a growing sense of unease twisted in his chest. What he saw when he reached the doorway would haunt him forever, burned into his memory like a photograph of his own near destruction. Ava stood at the massive farmhouse sink, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she poured his entire bowl of soup down the drain with desperate urgency. The red liquid swirled and disappeared down the garbage disposal, taking with it what could very well have been his last conscious evening as a free man. Her small hands shook as she gripped the bowl, and her whole body trembled with the aftermath of tasting something that had terrified her to her very core. "Ava?" His voice came out barely above a whisper, rough with confusion and growing alarm. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Before she could answer, before she could explain the danger she'd just saved him from, Natalie's designer heels clicked against the marble floor with sharp staccato precision. She appeared in the doorway like a magazine cover come to life, perfectly styled auburn hair that caught the light like silk, flawless makeup that could have graced a red carpet, designer dress that hugged her curves in all the right places and screamed success and sophistication. Everything about her was calculated to project trustworthiness, competence, desirability. She was the kind of woman who turned heads in boardrooms and charity galas, who made other men envious of Drake's apparent good fortune. "Oh my goodness," she laughed, the sound like crystal bells tinkling in a gentle breeze, perfectly modulated to convey just the right amount of amused exasperation. "What a mess we have here. Drake, darling, don't worry about this little incident. Children can be so dramatic sometimes, can't they? Their imaginations just run wild." She moved toward Ava with what looked like maternal grace but felt somehow predatory, her smile never wavering even as her eyes flashed with something cold and calculating. "Sweetheart, that was a very special soup I spent hours making just for your father. He's been working so incredibly hard, burning the candle at both ends, and I wanted to help him relax and get the rest he so desperately needs." Ava backed against the counter like a cornered animal, her blue eyes wide with a fear so pure and instinctive that it made Drake's protective instincts surge to life. "It tastes wrong, Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of trying to convince the adults around her of a truth they couldn't taste. "It tastes like medicine. Bad medicine." "Medicine?" Natalie's laugh grew sharper, taking on an edge that made the hair on Drake's arms stand up. What a silly imagination she has, though I suppose children do have such vivid fantasies, don't they? They see monsters under beds and danger in soup bowls. Drake, darling, you must be absolutely starving after that marathon conference call. Let me make you another bowl right away. But Drake wasn't looking at Natalie anymore, wasn't being swayed by her perfect explanations and reasonable tone. He was looking at his daughter, really looking at her with the focused attention he should have been giving her all along. The terror in her eyes wasn't manufactured or exaggerated. The way her whole body trembled wasn't theatrical attention-seeking. This was pure, primal, instinctive fear from a child who had just encountered genuine danger and was desperately trying to protect the person she loved most in the world. "Ava," he said gently, sinking to one knee so he could meet her eyes at her level, giving her the respect and attention her warning deserved. "Tell me exactly what you tasted, sweetheart. Every detail matters." Natalie's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something ugly and desperate flickering across her features, before she regained control. "Drake, really, you're not going to take a child's word over mine, are you? She's just jealous of our relationship, threatened by having another woman in your life. Lucy warned me this might happen. Children of single fathers often act out when their routines are disrupted." "The soup made my tongue go numb, Daddy," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute truth, like when Dr. Peterson gave me that medicine before my surgery, the one that made me feel floaty and strange. And it was bitter underneath all the tomato taste. Uncle Antonio taught me that bitter means someone's trying to hide something bad, that good food should never lie to you about what it is. Drake's blood ran cold as ice water flooded his veins. He remembered that dental surgery vividly, remembered how the sedative had transformed his bright, alert daughter into a drowsy, compliant shadow of herself. Remembered how frightened he'd been by the change, how wrong it had felt to see her, so unlike herself. "Where did you get the recipe, Natalie?" His voice carried a dangerous edge now, the tone he used in hostile corporate negotiations when he suspected someone was lying to his face. Her smile faltered completely now, cracks appearing in her perfect facade like fault lines in an earthquake. It's an old family recipe. My grandmother's, from the old country, from Italy. She passed it down through generations of women who knew how to take care of their men. But Drake's attention had shifted to something else, something that made his chest tighten with growing horror. On the counter, partially hidden behind the expensive coffee maker, sat an amber prescription bottle with a white cap. The label was turned away from him, but he could just make out the edge of his own name printed there in clinical black letters. A prescription he'd never filled. A prescription he'd never seen before. A prescription that had no business existing in his home. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the storm clouds that had settled over Ava's heart. She clutched her worn stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, a gift from her mother before the cancer took her, as she sat on a tall stool in Uncle Antonio's cozy restaurant kitchen. The familiar smells of garlic sautéing in olive oil, fresh oregano, and bread rising in ancient ovens usually made her feel safe and loved, transported to a world where food was honest and people were trustworthy. But today her stomach churned with worry and the lingering metallic taste of fear. Daddy had been so quiet after the soup incident, so distant and troubled. She'd seen him pacing the penthouse at 3 a.m, running his hands through his dark hair the way he did when business problems kept him awake. And Natalie had stayed the night, whispering things in Daddy's ear that made him frown and look at Ava with confusion and what looked horribly like doubt. The woman had been like a poisonous spider spinning her web, convincing him that his daughter was the problem, that her jealousy and imagination were threats to their happiness. Antonio Benedetti had been part of the Silvers family for as long as Ava could remember, longer even than her own memories stretched back. At 66, the Italian chef moved with the practiced grace and economy of motion that came from spending 50 years perfecting his craft, turning simple ingredients into poetry that could make grown men weep with joy. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of burns and cuts, could transform flour and eggs into silk, could coax flavors from tomatoes that most people never knew existed. His dark eyes, set deep in a face carved by years of laughter and sorrow, missed absolutely nothing. He'd known Ava's mother, Sarah, since before Ava was born, had catered their wedding with food so beautiful it was photographed for magazines. He'd held Drake's trembling hand at Sarah's funeral 3 years ago, and promised through his own tears to watch over both father and daughter, to be the protective uncle they needed. Most importantly, he understood that some gifts couldn't be taught or learned from books. They could only be recognized, nurtured, and protected from those who would dismiss or exploit them. "Uncle Antonio," Ava said quietly, her legs swinging from the tall stool as she struggled to find words for the terror that had gripped her. "Is there some kind of medicine that makes your tongue go numb and makes soup taste bitter? Like really bitter but hidden underneath good flavors?" Antonio's hands stilled over the pasta dough he'd been kneading with meditative rhythm, the smooth motion that usually calmed him when his thoughts grew dark. Something dangerous flickered deep in his eyes, a recognition that made his stomach clench with protective fury. "What kind of medicine, piccola mia? Tell your Uncle Antonio everything." "I don't know what kind," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle bubbling of sauces on nearby burners. "But when I tasted Natalie's soup yesterday, it reminded me of when I had to go to sleep for my tooth surgery. That floaty feeling, that strange taste that made everything seem far away. And you always told me that when food tastes wrong, it usually is wrong. That honest food never lies about what it is." The old chef's weathered face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd tried to warn Drake about Natalie from the very beginning, from the first time she'd swept into their lives with her perfect smile and designer clothes. Something about her had been too polished, too calculated, too perfectly designed to appeal to a grieving widower's vulnerabilities. In his long experience with people, those who tried that hard to appear trustworthy usually weren't. Those who insisted on controlling every meal, every moment, every decision were usually hiding something dark beneath their helpful facade. "Tell me everything, Bambina," he said, washing his hands and moving to sit beside her on another stool, giving her his complete attention the way adults should but so rarely did. "Every detail, every taste, every feeling. Your Uncle Antonio believes you." Ava described the taste with the precision of a trained chef, the way the bitterness tried to hide beneath the familiar sweetness of tomatoes and the earthy comfort of basil. She told him about the strange numbness that spread across her tongue, about the metallic aftertaste that lingered long after she'd spit out the soup. She described Daddy's confused expression when she poured the soup away, the way his eyes had looked glassy and unfocused even before he'd taken a single sip. She talked about how Natalie's eyes went cold and calculating when she thought no one was looking, how her smile never quite reached those emerald eyes that watched everything with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Antonio listened with growing alarm, his chef's intuition and his protective instincts both screaming danger. He'd seen this before, back in the old country during his youth when desperate people did desperate things for money and power, when women or men used the intimacy of shared meals to slowly poison their victims, to gain control through chemical manipulation disguised as love and care. "Ava, I need you to do something very brave for me," he said finally, his voice gentle but urgent. "Do you think there might be any of that soup left somewhere? Maybe some that spilled during cooking? Or perhaps the pot wasn't washed completely?" Ava nodded eagerly, hope flickering in her blue eyes for the first time since the nightmare began. "Lucy said Natalie threw the pot in the dishwasher right away, but she forgot to rinse it first like she always does. She never rinses anything properly. Lucy complains about it all the time because it leaves spots and residue." Antonio smiled grimly, his mind already racing with possibilities. Sloppy criminals always made the best evidence, leaving traces of their crimes in places they thought no one would think to look. An hour later, he stood in Drake's pristine kitchen with a small evidence collection bag borrowed from his nephew, who worked in forensics, carefully scraping dried residue from the supposedly clean pot with the methodical precision of a detective. What he found made his blood boil with protective rage. Tiny white particles that hadn't dissolved completely, particles that clung to the stainless steel despite the dishwasher's industrial-strength cleaning cycle, particles that had no business in any soup, no matter how special or medicinal the recipe claimed to be. He'd have answers by evening. The question that terrified him was whether Drake would believe those answers, or whether Natalie's psychological manipulation had already taken too firm a hold. As he worked, Ava watched from the doorway with the wide-eyed intensity of a child, witnessing something that would change her understanding of the world forever. "Uncle Antonio? Am I in trouble for not trusting her? Daddy seemed so upset with me." The old chef's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Here was a child apologizing for protecting her father, doubting her own extraordinary instincts because the adults around her had made her feel wrong for being right, guilty for seeing through a predator's disguise. "No, Bambina Mia," he said, firmly, setting down his collection tools and pulling her into a fierce hug that smelled of garlic and safety and unconditional love. "You are never, ever in trouble for trusting yourself. Your mama gave you a precious gift. She gave you the ability to taste truth and lies. Use it always, protect it always, and never let anyone convince you that gift is wrong." He pulled Yao out his phone and scrolled to his most trusted contact, Dr. Maria Santos, a forensic toxicologist who owed him several favors from the time he'd helped expose a restaurant owner who'd been poisoning competitors' food critics. If there was something harmful in that soup residue, Maria would find it within hours using equipment that could detect substances in parts per billion. But first, he needed to call Lucy. The nanny had been with the family since Ava was 3 years old, had watched every change and development in their household dynamics. If Natalie was systematically drugging Drake, Lucy would have noticed other signs, other subtle changes that pointed to chemical manipulation, other evidence that could help them build a case strong enough to pierce through a beautiful woman's perfect lies. That evening, Drake's penthouse felt like a battlefield. Natalie had discovered the empty soup pot in the dishwasher, and her rage was spectacular to behold. She paced the living room like a caged animal, her perfect facade finally cracking to reveal something ugly underneath. She poured it out. Natalie's voice rose to a pitch that made Ava shrink behind the couch. "That little brat poured out the soup I spent hours making. Drake, you can't let her treat me like this." Drake sat in his leather armchair, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. The stress of the upcoming IPO was crushing him, and now he had to deal with family drama too. Part of him just wanted peace. Part of him wanted everyone to get along, so he could focus on saving his company. Ava was just scared, he said wearily. She thought something was wrong with the soup. "Scared?" Natalie's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "She's manipulating you. Can't you see that? She doesn't want me here, so she's making up stories to turn you against me." She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. Her touch was soft, practiced, persuasive. "Darling, I know this is hard. Blending families always is, but you can't let a 7-year-old run your household. She needs boundaries. She needs discipline." Drake looked across the room at Ava, who was trying to make herself invisible behind the couch cushions. His little girl, who'd never lied to him about anything important. His daughter, who'd held his hand through the darkest days after Sarah's death. But Natalie was right about the stress, and she'd been so helpful, so caring. She cooked his meals, managed his schedule, even helped with business decisions. Life was easier with her around. "Ava," his voice came out harder than he intended. "Come here." Ava approached slowly, her blue eyes already filling with tears. She could see the disappointment in Daddy's face, the way he believed Natalie over her. "Did you pour out Natalie's soup?" "Yes, but Daddy—" "That was disrespectful," Drake said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Natalie worked hard to make that soup for me. You wasted her time and effort. But it tasted wrong." Ava's voice broke. "It tasted like medicine." "Enough." The shout surprised even Drake. He never raised his voice at Ava. Never. But the pressure was so intense and Natalie's expectations so clear. "You will apologize to Natalie right now." Ava stared at him in shock. This wasn't her daddy. This wasn't the man who'd taught her to trust her instincts, who'd praised her special palate, who'd told her that her opinion mattered. "I won't," she whispered. "Excuse me? I won't apologize for trying to protect you." The words exploded out of her, The soup was wrong, Daddy. Something was in it that shouldn't be there, but you always trust other people more than me. She turned and ran toward her room, her sobs echoing through the penthouse. Drake started to follow, but Natalie's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let her go," she said softly. "She needs to learn that actions have consequences. Maybe some time alone will help her think about what she's done." Drake sank back into his chair, guilt churning in his stomach. He'd just chosen his girlfriend over his daughter. He'd dismissed Ava's concerns without even considering that she might be right. But Natalie was already moving toward the kitchen, talking about making him something to help him relax. Something to take the edge off this horrible evening, something to help him sleep. Upstairs, Ava cried into her pillow and wondered if her daddy would ever believe her again. Outside her window, the city lights blurred through her tears, and somewhere, in the distance, a phone was ringing in Uncle Antonio's restaurant. The test results were in. The call came at exactly 11:47 p.m., shattering the uneasy quiet that had settled over the penthouse like a suffocating blanket. Drake, finally unconscious after consuming Natalie's special chamomile tea laced with enough sedatives to fell a horse, didn't hear his phone buzzing insistently against the mahogany nightstand beside their king-sized bed. His breathing was unnaturally deep and labored, his body completely limp in a way that spoke of chemical intervention rather than natural sleep. But Lucy did hear the call. The nanny had been with the Silvers family since Ava turned 3 years old, hired initially to help with the transition after Sarah's cancer diagnosis. She'd watched the little girl grow from a fearful toddler into a remarkable child with gifts that shouldn't be dismissed or ignored. More importantly, Lucy had witnessed every subtle change in the household dynamics since Natalie's arrival 6 months ago. The way Drake's eyes had grown increasingly distant and glassy. The way his hands shook some mornings as if he were withdrawing from something. The way he'd started forgetting conversations they'd had just hours before, losing track of appointments, making uncharacteristic business decisions that put his company at risk. She'd been documenting everything in a private journal, photographing prescription bottles that appeared and disappeared, keeping careful notes about Drake's behavioral changes and Ava's growing distress. Tonight, as she sat in the dimly lit hallway outside Drake's bedroom, she could hear Natalie moving around downstairs with the restless energy of someone whose plans were unraveling. She answered Antonio's call on the first ring, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucy, thank God you're awake." The chef's voice was tight with urgent alarm. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The soup residue I collected and had tested, it contained massive amounts of alprazolam. That's a powerful benzodiazepine sedative, Lucy. Someone has been systematically drugging Drake for months." The nanny's blood turned to ice water in her veins as her worst fears were confirmed. "How much are we talking about, Antonio?" "Enough to cause severe memory problems, cognitive impairment, confusion, and extreme drowsiness. Dr. Santos said if he'd been taking this dosage regularly over months." Antonio's voice trailed off, but they both understood the implications. Chronic benzodiazepine poisoning could cause permanent brain damage, could turn a brilliant businessman into a compliant shadow of himself. "Antonio, there's more." Lucy's voice dropped to barely audible as she glanced toward the master bedroom where Drake lay unconscious. "I found something today when I was doing laundry. Receipts hidden in Natalie's purse, stuffed behind credit cards like she thought no one would ever look. She's been using Drake's credit card to buy medications under multiple fake names from different pharmacies across the city. She'd been suspicious for weeks, watching Natalie's behavior with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years caring for children and recognizing when adults were lying. The way Natalie always insisted on cooking Drake's meals personally, never allowing Lucy or even the professional chef they sometimes hired to prepare his food. The way she became agitated and controlling when Ava was in the kitchen during meal preparation. The way she'd started suggesting with increasing frequency that maybe Drake should consider sending Ava to boarding school, for her own good, of course, to give her more structure and socialization. "What kinds of medications, Lucy?" Antonio's voice was deadly quiet. "Alprazolam from 3 different pharmacies, Ambien, temazepam. Even some over-the-counter sleep aids and antihistamines that can cause drowsiness. Antonio? She's been experimenting on him like he's a laboratory rat, testing different combinations and dosages to see what works best for her purposes. The chef's curse in Italian was colorful enough to blister paint off the walls. We need to call the police immediately. And tell them what exactly? Lucy's voice carried years of experience dealing with skeptical authorities. That his beautiful, helpful girlfriend has been making him soup? We need more proof, Antonio. Something absolutely undeniable that can't be explained away by smooth talking and crocodile tears. They both knew how these cases typically went. A stunning woman with perfect credentials accused by a nanny and an elderly chef, against a successful businessman who appeared devoted to her and seemed to be thriving under her care. The police would need ironclad evidence, multiple witnesses, and preferably a confession before they'd even consider pressing charges. There's something else, Lucy continued, her voice gaining strength as she prepared to reveal her most damning evidence. I've been watching the nanny cam footage from Ava's room, not to spy on her, but because I was worried about those nightmares she's been having lately, the way she's been crying in her sleep. But the camera angle picks up part of the hallway too, and last week I saw something that made my blood run cold. She paused, gathering courage for what she was about to reveal, knowing that this information would change everything. I saw Natalie going through Drake's home office at 3 a.m. when she thought everyone was asleep. She had his laptop open, was photographing documents with her phone, financial records, contracts for the IPO, client lists, proprietary, formulas for his functional food products. She was stealing everything, Antonio. Industrial espionage on a massive scale. The pieces clicked together in Antonio's mind with horrifying clarity, forming a picture so sinister it took his breath away. This wasn't just about controlling Drake through chemical manipulation. This wasn't just about a gold digger trying to secure her financial future. This was about completely destroying him, stealing his company's secrets and positioning herself to profit from his downfall. A drugged, confused CEO couldn't make sound business decisions. And if he made critical mistakes during the IPO process, if confidential information leaked to competitors, if his judgment became so compromised that investors lost confidence. She's trying to sabotage the entire company, he breathed, the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. Create chaos during the IPO, steal the proprietary information, then probably disappear with everything while Drake takes the blame for the disaster. Or worse, Lucy added grimly, her voice heavy with implication. Maybe she's planning to have him declared mentally incompetent. With his erratic behavior, his memory problems, his increasingly poor business decisions, it wouldn't be hard to build a case for a conservatorship, especially if she has medical documentation of his decline and witnesses to his instability. Antonio, what do we do? If we're wrong about any of this? If we're wrong, Drake loses a girlfriend and feels embarrassed for a few weeks. If we're right, he loses everything. His company, his fortune, his freedom, possibly even his life. And Ava loses the only parent she has left. They talked for another 40 minutes, formulating a plan that would require precision timing and nerves of steel. They needed to catch Natalie in the act of drugging Drake's food. They needed video evidence of her adding substances to his meals. They needed her to confess to something that couldn't be explained away by claims of innocent help or medical assistance. Meanwhile, 3 stories below them in her pink bedroom, Ava lay wide awake despite the late hour. She'd heard fragments of Lucy's hushed phone conversation through the thin walls, her extraordinary hearing picking up enough words to understand that the adults were finally beginning to believe her warnings. Her heart pounded with vindication, and terror in equal measure. Vindication that she'd been right all along. Terror at how close they'd all come to losing Daddy forever. She'd been right. She'd been right about the danger, right about the soup, right about Natalie's true nature. But would anyone be able to prove it before it was too late? Outside her window, dawn was beginning to creep across the Manhattan skyline in shades of rose and gold, painting the city in deceptively beautiful colors. In a few hours, Natalie would wake up and start preparing breakfast for Drake. Another opportunity to drug him into compliance. Another chance to steal more pieces of his mind and his company's future. Another day closer to whatever endgame she'd been planning all along. Ava slipped quietly out of bed and padded to her computer desk, her small fingers moving with determined purpose. If the adults needed more proof, she'd help them get it. She might only be 7 years old, but she knew how to record videos on her tablet without making noise. She knew exactly where to hide in the kitchen pantry so no one would see her, and she knew that tomorrow might be their last chance to save her father from the woman who was slowly killing him, one spoonful at a time. Tomorrow, they would catch Natalie red-handed, or Drake Silvers would disappear forever into a chemical fog from which there might be no return. The only question was whether they could execute their plan before Natalie realized her perfect crime was unraveling around her. The trap was set with the precision of a Swiss watch and the deadly seriousness of a military operation. Drake, finally aware of the mortal danger he'd been living with, but still struggling with disbelief and the lingering effects of months of chemical manipulation, had agreed to Antonio's carefully orchestrated plan. They would stage one final dinner, one last chance for Natalie to reveal her true nature, and provide the undeniable evidence they needed to destroy her completely. The elegant dining room had been transformed into a theatrical stage where justice would finally be served alongside the poisoned meal. Hidden cameras, courtesy of Drake's high-tech security team, captured every angle with crystal-clear precision. Lucy positioned herself strategically in the kitchen with a direct view of all food preparation, her phone ready to record everything. Ava, against all protests from the adults who wanted to protect her innocence, insisted on hiding in the walk-in pantry with her tablet, determined to witness her father's vindication and her tormentor's downfall. "You've absolutely outdone yourself tonight, darling," Drake said with carefully practiced enthusiasm as Natalie emerged from the kitchen carrying a sterling silver tray like an offering to the gods. The main course was her signature risotto, creamy, aromatic, visually stunning, and undoubtedly laced with enough pharmaceutical sedatives to render him unconscious for the next 12 hours. The rich saffron color disguised the bitter powder she'd stirred in with such loving care, but tonight was different. Tonight, Drake had casually mentioned that Antonio and Lucy would be joining them for dinner, a seemingly innocent invitation that sent shockwaves through Natalie's carefully controlled world. Oh, Natalie's magazine-perfect smile flickered, like a candle in a hurricane, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the predator lurking beneath. "I didn't realize we were having guests tonight. I only prepared enough risotto for 2 people. You know how precise Italian cooking must be." "That's perfectly fine," Antonio said smoothly, settling his weathered frame into the mahogany chair across from Drake with the casual confidence of a man who'd faced down much worse predators in his long life. "Lucy and I aren't particularly hungry tonight. We'll just have small portions to be polite." "Actually," Lucy added with carefully practiced innocence, her voice carrying just the right note of appreciation, "that risotto smells absolutely wonderful, Natalie. The aroma is incredible. Could I possibly have just a tiny taste? I've been trying to perfect my own risotto technique." Natalie's grip tightened on the serving spoon until her knuckles went white, her perfect manicure digging crescents into her palms. It's a very specific recipe with precisely measured portions. The ingredient ratios are calculated exactly for Drake's nutritional needs. Adding more guests might upset the delicate balance of flavors and nutrients. Drake watched her with the focused intensity of a hawk studying its prey, noting every micro-expression, every telltale sign of panic that she was trying desperately to suppress. The woman who'd insisted for months that cooking was her greatest passion, who claimed to find joy in nourishing others, was now frantically trying to prevent anyone else from tasting her creation. "Nonsense," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had built a business empire. "There's plenty for everyone. I insist that you serve our guests. After all, hospitality is what makes a house a home, isn't it? Drake, really, I must insist that this particular meal is specifically formulated just for you." Natalie's voice rose slightly, desperation bleeding through her usual silk-smooth tones. "You've been working so incredibly hard on the IPO, and I crafted this risotto with special ingredients designed to help you relax and restore your energy. It might not agree with everyone's digestive system." "Help me relax?" Drake's voice carried a dangerous edge now, the tone he'd used to demolish competitors in hostile takeovers. Exactly how does this risotto help me relax, Natalie? What special ingredients are we talking about? The question hung in the air like smoke from a deadly fire, toxic and suffocating. Antonio and Lucy exchanged meaningful glances across the polished table. In the pantry, Ava held her breath so tightly her chest ached, her tablet recording every precious second of her father's salvation. Natalie's perfect composure was cracking like ice in a spring thaw, hairline fractures spreading across her facade with each passing second. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she clutched the serving spoon like a weapon, sweat beginning to bead along her hairline despite the air conditioning. It's just comfort food, darling. High-quality ingredients, complex flavors. You know how certain foods can be naturally soothing when you're under tremendous stress? Then you won't mind if Antonio and Lucy sample it too? Drake pressed, his blue eyes boring into hers with laser intensity. After all, we're all under stress these days. We could all use some natural relaxation. Of course not. The words came out too quickly, too sharp, revealing the panic she was fighting to control. It's just that, well, they might not fully appreciate the complexity and sophistication of the flavors. This is quite an advanced culinary creation. Antonio's weathered face transformed into granite, his dark eyes flashing with barely controlled rage. In 60 years of professional cooking, in kitchens from Rome to New York, I have never encountered a flavor profile I couldn't appreciate or understand, young lady. And I've been caring for this family long enough to recognize what's genuinely good for them versus what might cause harm. Lucy added quietly, her words carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. Natalie was cornered now like a wild animal, and everyone in the room could sense the desperation radiating from her in waves. Drake lifted his fork toward the risotto with theatrical deliberation, and she watched with the intensity of someone whose entire future depended on what happened in the next 60 seconds. You know what? He said conversationally, his tone so casual it was almost mocking. Before we begin this lovely meal, why don't you help me understand something that's been puzzling me? I found some interesting prescription bottles hidden in your purse this morning. Would you care to explain those? The serving spoon clattered to the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. I don't know what you're talking about, Natalie whispered, but her face had gone pale as fresh snow. Really? Drake's voice was ice and steel forged in the fires of betrayal. The alprazolam prescribed under the name Jennifer Walsh? The Ambien for someone called Sarah Mitchell? The temazepam for Maria Rodriguez? 5 different bottles, Natalie, all filled using my credit card. All bearing names that don't exist in any database, all containing enough controlled substances to kill a small horse. Natalie's perfect mask was disintegrating before their eyes, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. Drake, I can explain everything. Please do, he interrupted with deadly calm. Explain why you've been systematically buying sedatives under multiple false identities. Explain why my daughter detected medicine traces in her food when she tried to protect me. Explain why I've been losing pieces of my memory, my judgment, my very sense of self ever since you moved into our lives. You don't understand. The words exploded out of her like shrapnel from a bomb. You've been impossible to live with. So stressed, so anxious, so completely out of control. I was trying to help you. You needed to relax. You needed to sleep. You needed someone to take care of the decisions that were overwhelming you. So you drugged me? The question was barely above a whisper but carried the force of a hurricane. I was helping you manage your stress. Natalie was standing now. Her designer dress wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run with perspiration and tears. You were having panic attacks that were getting worse every day. You were making terrible business decisions that could have destroyed everything you'd worked for. I was trying to help you get through the IPO process without having a complete mental breakdown. The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. In the pantry, Ava's tablet captured every word with perfect clarity. In the kitchen, Lucy's phone recorded the entire breakdown for posterity. At the head of the table, Drake sat in stunned silence as the woman he'd trusted with his life, his home, his daughter's welfare, admitted to systematically poisoning him for months, but Natalie wasn't finished destroying herself. Besides, she spat, her mask completely gone now, revealing the venomous creature that had been hiding underneath. What's the real harm in what I did? You were sleeping better than you had in years. You were calmer, more manageable, easier to live with. You would have been perfectly fine if that spoiled little brat hadn't interfered with her ridiculous claims and dramatic tantrums. Antonio stood slowly, his entire body vibrating with protective rage. That spoiled little brat saved her father's life with her courage and her gift. She's a manipulative child who doesn't understand what's best for anyone. Natalie turned on him with pure fury, her composure completely shattered. You all treated me like I was some kind of monster, when all I did was care for him. All I did was love him enough to help him when he couldn't help himself. Love? Drake's voice was barely audible, hollow with betrayal and disbelief. You call systematically poisoning someone love? I call it necessity, Natalie screamed, spittle flying from her lips. You think I enjoyed having to slip medicine into your food like some kind of criminal? You think I wanted to sneak around crushing pills, measuring dosages? But you left me absolutely no choice. You were falling apart completely, and someone had to take control before you destroyed everything. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the soft whir of hidden cameras capturing every word of her confession, every damning admission that would seal her fate in court. Drake looked at this woman he'd thought he loved, this creature he'd welcomed into his home and his bed, and saw a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger, he saw someone who'd been systematically stealing his mind, his autonomy, his very sense of self while convincing him it was love. Get out, he said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than any shout could have managed. Drake, please, you have to understand. Get out of my house. The roar echoed through the penthouse like thunder from an avenging god. Natalie stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally desperate calculation, as she realized her perfect crime had crumbled to dust. She grabbed her purse and ran for the door, her heels clicking frantically against the marble as she fled like the predator she'd always been. They could hear the elevator doors slam shut, taking her out of their lives forever. But the damage she'd done, to Drake's health, to his relationship with Ava, to his faith, in his own judgment, would take much longer to heal than her crimes would take to prosecute. 2 weeks later, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office buzzed with activity as prosecutors built their case against Natalie Morrison. Her real name, it turned out. She'd been using an alias since moving to New York, fleeing embezzlement charges in California that she'd thought were buried forever. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage of her adding crushed pills to Drake's food, financial records showing systematic theft from his accounts, forged prescriptions and multiple fakey names. Most damning of all, her own recorded confession that she'd been drugging him for months. But the legal victory felt hollow compared to the personal wreckage she'd left behind. Drake sat in his kitchen, their kitchen, watching Ava stir a pot of homemade tomato soup, the same recipe his wife Sarah had taught her before the cancer took her away. Simple, honest ingredients. Nothing hidden, nothing false. Does it taste right, Daddy? Ava asked, offering him the wooden spoon. He tasted it carefully, noting the perfect balance of sweet tomatoes and fresh basil, no bitter undertones, no numbness, just the pure, clean flavors that he'd forgotten were possible. Perfect, he said, and meant it. The past 2 weeks had been a journey back to himself. Without the constant fog of sedatives, his mind was sharp, again. His hands had stopped shaking. The panic attacks that Natalie claimed to be treating had disappeared entirely, because she'd been causing them with her pharmaceutical cocktails. I'm sorry I didn't believe you, he said for the 100th time. Ava looked up at him with Sarah's eyes. You believe me now. That's what matters. The kitchen door swung open as Antonio arrived for their daily cooking lesson. The old chef had appointed himself Drake's nutritional guardian, ensuring that every meal was prepared with transparency and love. Lucy followed close behind, carrying grocery bags filled with fresh vegetables from the farmer's market. "How's our little chef today?" Antonio asked, ruffling Ava's pigtails. "I'm teaching Daddy how to taste things properly," she announced proudly. "He's getting better at it." It was true. Without the chemical interference, Drake was rediscovering flavors he'd forgotten existed. More importantly, he was learning to trust his instincts again, to listen to the small voice inside that whispered warnings when something wasn't quite right, the voice that sounded remarkably like his daughter's. "Uncle Antonio," Ava said as she ladled soup into bowls, "will you help me write something on the kitchen board?" Drake looked up at the whiteboard where they kept grocery lists and family reminders. Ava approached it with a serious expression, carefully writing in her best 7-year-old penmanship. "The safest ingredient is trust, and Ava always gets the last taste." Drake felt tears prick his eyes. His daughter had forgiven him completely, but she was also ensuring that this mistake could never happen again. From now on, every meal in their home would pass through Ava's remarkable palate first. Her gift would be their protection. "There's something else we need to discuss," Lucy said gently. She'd been holding back the news all morning, waiting for the right moment. "The police called. Natalie's been charged with attempted poisoning, fraud, and theft. She's looking at 10 to 15 years. Drake nodded grimly. Justice was important, but it couldn't undo the months of manipulation and control. It couldn't restore the father-daughter trust that had been damaged. That would take time, patience, and a lot of shared meals cooked with love instead of deception. "Daddy?" Ava's voice was small. "Are you going to find another girlfriend?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because if you do, I want to cook with her first. I want to make sure she's safe." Drake knelt down to Ava's level, taking her small hands in his. "No girlfriends for a long while, okay? I think we have enough excitement for now. Besides, I've got the best cooking partner right here." Ava beamed at him, and for the first time in months, Drake felt like they were going to be okay. That evening, as they sat down to their simple dinner of soup and bread, Drake offered a toast. "To Ava," he said, raising his water glass. "For trusting herself when no one else would listen, for saving her father from his own poor judgment, for reminding us all that sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message." "To Ava," Antonio and Lucy echoed. "To family," Ava added softly, "the kind that keeps each other safe." They ate their soup in comfortable silence, tasting every ingredient, trusting every flavor. Outside the kitchen windows, Manhattan sparkled with evening lights, but inside this room, all was warmth and safety and love, the way it should be. The way it would be from now on, because sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages. Sometimes wisdom speaks with a 7-year-old's voice. And sometimes the most important text message you'll ever receive is just 4 simple words. Don't eat the soup. 6 months later, Drake Silver stood before a room full of investors as his company completed the most successful IPO in the functional food industry's history. His mind was clear, his decisions sharp, his leadership unquestioned. The man who had nearly lost everything to a predator's chemical manipulation had emerged stronger than ever. But the real victory wasn't measured in stock prices or market valuations. It was measured in trust rebuilt, one shared meal at a time. The Silvers. Family had developed new traditions since Natalie's arrest. Every Sunday, Drake, Ava, Antonio, and Lucy gathered in the penthouse kitchen for what they called honest cooking hour. No secrets, no hidden ingredients. Every spice labeled, every step transparent, every taste tested by their resident expert. With the remarkable palate, Ava had become something of a legend in their social circle. The 7-year-old who'd saved her father from a poisoner. Local news stations had wanted to interview her, but Drake protected his daughter's privacy fiercely. Some stories were too important to turn into spectacle. Instead, they'd started a small foundation, trust your taste, dedicated to teaching children to listen to their instincts and adults to listen to their children. Because Ava's story wasn't unique, it was simply the one that had ended well. "Daddy, taste this," Ava called from the stove where she was preparing her latest creation. Butternut squash soup with sage and honey. Drake dutifully tasted the wooden spoon she offered. "Perfect," he said, and it was. Clean, honest flavors, with nothing to hide. "How can you tell?" she asked, genuinely curious. Her father's palate had improved dramatically, but she still worried about his ability to detect danger. "Because you made it," he said simply. "And because I've learned to trust the right people." It had taken months of therapy to work through the manipulation he'd endured, to understand how Natalie had isolated him from his support system, made him doubt his own judgment, convinced him to dismiss his daughter's warnings. The psychological damage had been almost as severe as the physical poisoning, but healing had come through honesty, through admitting his mistakes, through accepting that his 7-year-old daughter had been wiser than him when it mattered most. "Uncle." "Antonio says I have a gift," Ava said, stirring the soup thoughtfully. "But sometimes gifts feel scary. What if I taste something wrong and no one believes me again?" Drake set down his work and gave her his full attention. This was the conversation he'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "Ava, listen to me very carefully. Your gift isn't just about tasting food. It's about sensing when things aren't right, even when everyone else thinks they are. That's rare, and it's precious, and it will serve you your whole life." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But the most important lesson isn't about your gift. It's about mine. My job as your father is to listen to you, especially when what you're saying is difficult to hear. I failed at that job once and I nearly lost everything because of it." Ava looked up at him with those serious blue eyes that missed nothing. "So here's what I promise you," Drake continued. "If you ever taste something wrong, or feel something wrong, or know something wrong, even if I can't see it, even if no one else agrees, I will listen. I will investigate. I will trust you first and ask questions later. Even if it makes people angry, especially if it makes people angry. Because people who get angry when children tell the truth are usually people with something to hide." Ava nodded solemnly, then broke into the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. "Okay, Daddy, but can we also promise that we'll cook together every Sunday forever, so we always know what's in our food?" "Forever," he agreed. Lucy appeared, in the doorway, holding her phone. "Drake, there's someone here to see you. A reporter from the Financial Times. She wants to know the secret to your successful recovery after the incident." Drake looked at Ava, who was still stirring her soup with the focused concentration of a master chef. His daughter, who'd saved his life with 4 words and a wooden spoon. His little girl who'd trusted herself when all the adults around her had failed. "Tell her the secret is simple," he said. "Listen to your children, trust their instincts, and never ever dismiss their warnings just because they come in small packages." He turned back to Ava. "Now, how about we finish this soup and then work on dessert? I was thinking something sweet and honest, no surprises." "Apple pie," Ava declared immediately. "With cinnamon and love, nothing else." "Nothing else," Drake agreed. Because sometimes the most profound truths were the simplest ones. Sometimes safety came from transparency. Sometimes wisdom spoke with a child's voice. And sometimes the difference between life and death was as simple as trusting the person who loved you enough to speak up, even when the whole world told them to be quiet. In the end, that was the real recipe for protection. 1 part vigilance, 1 part honesty, and unlimited measures of trust between people who truly cared for each other. The safest ingredient indeed was love that paid attention. Every child deserves to be heard. Every parent deserves to know when danger comes disguised as care. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to trust the small voices that speak big truths, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to remember that children's instincts are often our first and best defense against those who would harm us. Because in a world full of hidden dangers, the clearest warnings often come from the purest hearts. What story will you listen to today? What voice will you choose to trust? The answer might just save a life.